the worst case scenario if Colorado makes C.R.E. legal? Nothing. That's the worst case that happens. It's not like, oh, well, the taxpayers are out a bunch of money or something.
Right.
None of that happens. The other important thing is, in terms of like, when Excel starts pushing back, okay, Excel, so you're going to push back against the idea that some third party is going to come in, try to court a prospective customer of yours by saying, yeah, we're going to build everything from scratch. And somehow that's going to be better and cheaper than what you can provide, Excel. If that's true, Excel, you should lose your monopoly license right now.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of PowerGab, your go-to show for all things energy and environmental policy in the state of Colorado. I'm Jake Fogleman, joined by my co-host Amy Cooke. And this week we have a special guest with us because we're going to dive into what I think is frankly a pretty exciting topic. It's a new way of looking at utility regulation. Now, before your eyes glaze over when you hear that phrase, I promise this is more exciting than it sounds. Longtime listeners to this show and followers of Independence Institute's work know that we have long been proponents of altering the monopoly utility structure because of some of the perverse incentives that entails, and current present events and changes in the way that electricity is being demanded among consumers have presented new opportunities to do that in sort of novel ways. Before I give away too much, I'll kick it over to Amy, who's going to introduce our guest and tell us about this exciting idea.
Yeah, I got to tell you, Jake, for you and me, we're both kind of giddy about this. This is a little bit Christmas morning and unwrapping something super exciting. It's under the tree and you just can't wait to unwrap it. So yeah, we are a little bit giddy here today. Want to introduce to you all, we're just thrilled to have him on the show. His name is Glen Lyons. He is the founder of Advocates for consumer regulated electricity. And in just a moment, you're going to find out more of what that means exactly. Glen used to be with ExxonMobil. He was also on the board of ERCOT for several years. So he's got that background. He is well versed in energy and electricity generation space. And he along with Travis Fisher, which is how we found him. Travis is a favorite of mine and Jake's, and he's with Cato. He was at FERC for a while. I mean, Travis is one of the smart. Travis is almost always the smartest guy in the room, but also humble. So when Travis recommends somebody, we listen. And he, of course, recommended Glen, and we're thrilled to have him on the show. But real quick, I also want to let you all know he also wrote a paper, and this is just near and dear to our hearts. Listen to the title of this paper: "In Search of a Market to Improve Reliability in the U.S. Electricity Sector." Music to our ears. Welcome to the show, Glen Lyons. Glen, what the heck is consumer regulated electricity? I think you might upset a few utilities when they hear that phrase.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. And let me start with a scene set, because I think that's the way to make sense out of it. So there is this crush of new demand coming into the electricity sector. Data centers are into the electricity sector. Data centers are the thing that get the biggest headlines. So whether it's data centers in the traditional sense, or it's artificial intelligence, or in some cases it might be Bitcoin and other crypto mining, but just the potential for one or a few of these new data centers to equal the amount of electricity consumption that historically a small town, a city might have used. And so that's creating a problem. We're seeing that the electricity sector, is not able to keep pace with that demand. There was a recent headline about Dominion, the big utility in Virginia, basically telling all data centers nothing more for another 7 years. 7 years. Think about that. Especially if you're in a fast-moving, dynamic industry you can't wait 7 years. So you got that going on. Then you also have this problem of, and I'll think about a Wall Street Journal headline from a month ago or so that was something to the effect of, get ready to pay more for electricity and get less reliability. So you've got increasing demand, we can't meet it, we're increasing prices, and we're losing reliability all at the same time. And the problem we face in trying to figure out how do we get through all of these is we have this heavily, heavily regulated sector that we set up 100 years ago. It not only has state regulation, you've got a federal overlay, and things move very slowly. You've got processes to follow. All of these regulated processes give people, independent parties, an opportunity to interject their views. You got to bring tens, if not hundreds, of stakeholders together. And regulators inherently are going to be risk averse. That's just the nature of the job. If I'm a regulator, the worst thing in the world that happens to me is something bad happens on my watch, and then I get blamed for it. So I don't want that. I'm going to be super risk averse. And that does not create an environment in which you can resolve the problems I mentioned with the electricity sector. So our concept is that consumer regulated electricity is basically state policy that would allow for the creation of new islanded, and I'll explain that word in a second, islanded and unregulated electricity grids. So parties would build out their own electricity grid, kind of like an old-timey utility back in the day before there was regulation. And they might supply Google at one data center, and maybe Microsoft's got a data center over here, and maybe my former employer, ExxonMobil, is building some sort of new facility, and a C.R.E. grid would supply all these things. Islanded means that this grid could not connect up to any of the existing regulated grid. That's just kind of like, once you connect to the regulated grid, you are impacting it, and nobody's going to let you impact it without coming under some regulation yourself. I think it also creates an opportunity for these guys to go out and innovate, start with a clean sheet of paper, go out and do whatever they want. I mean, you can't do that today. And then unregulated, well, that means that you can move much faster than anybody else in the world, frankly. And where Dominion can't supply somebody for the next 7 years, well, if you're a C.R.E. unregulated utility, you can move as fast as you can move supply chains and line up all the necessary contracts. So that is C.R.E. in 2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah, the reason I just love this idea, we were talking a little bit before we started recording, just about data centers in particular, as you mentioned, have become sort of the cause of the moment. Everyone's talking about data centers. How are we going to, deal with load growth? Colorado hasn't seen so much of that load growth. It seems to be more concentrated in states like Virginia and Texas and a couple other Mountain West states, but Colorado hasn't been impacted yet. But that doesn't mean that policymakers aren't thinking about it. Just this past legislative session, there was a bill to try to incentivize data centers via tax credits. And as free marketeers, we were pretty opposed to that. We just, tax credits are just corporate welfare for these companies like Google and Facebook and what have you. But the reason I like this is it's not a tax credit, but it is an incentive. If something like this were to take place in a state like Colorado, it is an incentive to these potential data center operators because, as to your point, it streamlines their process to get up and running, and it allows them to, many of these companies have resource preferences, whether that's a clean power supply or a certain around-the-clock power supply, and it puts them in the driver's seat on that. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the big selling points. They get control, whether they want nothing but wind, solar, and batteries, or they want to start moving towards small modular nuclear reactors. But I think, frankly, the big selling point for a data center is going to be the speed. I mean, that's it. If I am, and I'm not picking on any companies for any reason other than their names that pop into my head. So if I'm Google and I'm trying to leapfrog chat gbt, the next version of chat gbt, with my next version of AI, I certainly don't have 7 years to wait.
Right.
Waiting a year is probably a problematic. So I need speed, and control is nice, but I think you're even seeing some of the data center companies kind of like, well, they're kind of backing off of some of their net zero ambitions because they need speed.
No, I want to ask, so we have talked to the folks at Google, and they did that partnership with Fervo, where Google and Fervo and this is that you talk about speed from inception to fruition was 4 years. And 2 of those years was Fervo courting Google to come with them. Once they got the go ahead and Google said, yeah, we'll pay for it for this geothermal plant, they were all in. And then it took 2 years to get this project built out. So which gets to your point, it's speed, but also they recognize that they also need reliable power. And I think that's a big part of it. They need their power to be, I mean, they need it 24/7. I want to ask this question, Glenn. You mentioned state policy, which is exactly what we talk about here, and we do it from a Colorado-centric point of view. Do you guys have model language, or have you seen any, or is there anything that you like? Obviously, what we'd have to do is allow for a private investor essentially to become a utility.
Right. So we have taken a shot at some language for Texas. Full disclosure, I'm not a lawyer. I'm a commercial person. And so, we haven't exactly had it scrubbed by a lawyer yet, but I did talk to a lawyer about just sort of my general thought process. And he was aligned with that. But conceptually, I think what, and I haven't studied Colorado specifically, but what you're doing is, so every state's going to have probably one primary piece of legislation which empowers its utility commission. So at a high level, and I know this is a very high level, you are taking that piece of legislation, you're going to amend it, you're going to define what a C.R.E. grid is. So it's independent, it's islanded, and then you're going to say, and it is hereby exempt from the rest of this legislation in which we've given the Utility Commission its authority over the sector.
What I really like about this, I just want to chime in one thing, and then I know Jake's got some questions, but one of the things I really like about this is data centers are driving much of the load growth, whether it is AI, or it's also, Bitcoin, or crypto mining. There's just so much out there now. For so long, utilities, their retail sales were relatively flat, right? They were flat, and because consumers had gotten more energy efficient, they were using energy more wisely, and they were purchasing products that were more energy efficient. This avoids ratepayers having to pay the exorbitant cost of these build outs of new projects, new power generation that is driven by, like I said, by data centers, by crypto mining, by all of these things. It is a way for them to not, at a time when consumers are stressed financially anyway. To me, it's a great way for them to avoid the high cost of those build outs.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. And in fact, one of the unique things about, I think, the data center load growth that makes it different from what we've seen in the past is these things keep getting bigger and bigger in size in terms of their electricity consumption. And you add one, and it used to be you add one and it's like adding maybe a Walmart. And then you add one, and it's like adding a business campus or something like that. And now you're adding one, and it's like adding a new industrial facility. And some of those being looked at in the not too distant future, it's like adding a new town or a city. This is something that the grid has not seen before. And to your point, I mean, I would not blame residential ratepayers if they get very upset about, like, why am I going to pay for this? For, again, not to keep picking on Google, it comes to my mind, but why am I going to pay for Google to hook up to my electricity grid? I don't want to pay for that. And I think it also then gives Google the opportunity to, right now they don't have an option. They kind of have two options in most cases. And I'm assuming this is true in Colorado again. You can either just hook up to the grid and take supply that way, or you can self-supply. And there's no option for, again, this idea of a new unregulated utility or grid. So that's really the idea here. Because if I'm Google, I mean, another, I think, selling point of C.R.E. is if I'm Google, even Google, capital is a scarce and precious resource. I don't want to invest my capital in electricity generation. I certainly don't want to use part of my workforce and have them focus on operating electricity generation. And, if you get into SMRs, I sure don't want to be involved in that. So let me have the opportunity to go to some third party who can do this. That's their expertise. And at the same time, they can bring the scale and reliability benefits that we have historically gotten out of a utility by supplying multiple customers instead of just it's a one-on-one transaction, because that limits kind of the scale and it limits the reliability.
Absolutely. Glenn, I kind of wanted to ask you, you mentioned sort of what it would take to enable this. And I think you're right. It's most of these states have sort of enabling legislation that authorizes the Public Utilities Commission. In a state like Colorado, it actually charters Xcel because we're a traditional vertically integrated regulated utility state. So I'm curious, along those lines, as you've been workshopping this idea, obviously you've written about it. Travis has written about it publicly. I'm sure you've done meetings and spoken at events about it. What has the reception been like, both in terms of people excited about the idea and those that are maybe opposed to the idea? I'm curious what kind of reception it's gotten.
So for the most part, we've gotten very positive reception. There are some who, when we encounter somebody who doesn't like it, I think they're not fully grasping the idea that, first of all, islanding isn't just a bug, it can be a feature. And most people think, oh, but you need to hook up to the grid. Well, but if you've got enough scale, maybe you don't need to hook up to the grid. Plus, which, if you don't hook up to the grid, well, again, clean sheet of paper in terms of designing your grid. You don't have to design it to connect up to Xcel. You can do whatever you think makes sense. So instead of trying to feed into this grid that was initially designed a century ago and we've kind of tacked on here and there, you can start from scratch. I think the opportunity is great in that regard. The other big pushback is that people assume, well, the costs are just going to be exorbitant. And I do think that would be a challenge for a C.R.E. grid developer, is to figure out, well, how am I going to make this cost effective? That, again, is part of the point of allowing them to connect to multiple end users, multiple consumers, so they can bring scale to it. But I also think, clean sheet of paper, you're unregulated. I think if you had C.R.E. go, within a few years, it would scarcely be recognizable how it operates versus the regulated utility world operates. They would be just like two different industries, because innovation, focus on the customer, things you simply cannot have in the existing world.
Yeah. The reason I ask, I'm thinking of the political economy sort of implications here. You have to imagine, at least in Colorado, an incumbent like Xcel would probably push back on this idea because it's potentially losing some of their rate base or potential rate base that
Right.
they could gain.
Right.
And they tend to be one of the biggest, if not the biggest, lobbying presence at the Capitol each year. But what I do love about it is a totally free market potential solution, because to your point, whoever would be the C.R.E. provider and the potential large industrial or commercial customers would be totally internalizing those costs. And like I said, it could be expensive up front. You'd probably take some of the bigger players in this space to be the first movers, I would imagine, just because of the capital involved. But if it goes wrong, it's not ratepayers on the hook for it going wrong. It's those folks internalizing it. Or at the end of the day, you create this enabling legislation and no one's interested. No harm, no foul. Nothing. Status quo.
Exactly.
And so I think that to me is what's most appealing. Amy, I don't know if you had any more follow-up questions as we're getting.
Yeah. Well, before we go, can I just jump in on a couple of things you said? So one is that yes, I think it's a key point is, what's the worst case scenario if Colorado makes C.R.E. legal? Nothing. That's the worst case that happens. It's not like, oh, well, the taxpayers are out a bunch of money or something.
Right.
None of that happens. The other important thing is, in terms of when Excel starts pushing back, okay, Excel, so you're going to push back against the idea that some third party is going to come in, try to court a prospective customer of yours by saying, yeah, we're going to build everything from scratch. And somehow that's going to be better and cheaper than what you can provide, Excel. If that's true, Excel, you should lose your monopoly license right now.
Yeah, great point.
I actually, as I was listening to the two of you talk about just sort of the economics of it, to me, this is the free marketeers. This should warm every free marketeer's heart, because it is a great economic development tool. And those of us in the space, in the public policy space, have been weary of ever using the term economic development, because it always means our money is being given to somebody else. But in this case, it truly is an economic development tool, because what you're offering is the freedom to power themselves. And it could be a large foundry. It could be so they're free to control their own power destiny, and the state is saying, you can do it here in the state of Colorado, and we're going to give you the freedom to do it. It isn't taxpayers' money, and it isn't ratepayers' money. It is literally giving them the freedom to power themselves. And that, for free marketeers, that should warm everyone's heart. It is the best economic development tool.
Amen. I agree with you completely. I think it has all the appeal to a free marketer, but if I'm a data center, the truth is, I don't care about that. I want my business to be as successful as possible.
Right.
If Colorado was the first state, and let's say the only state in the country that implemented C.R.E., that is huge competitive advantage for attracting new businesses, because the speed is just worth so much money to these guys.
And Colorado's not. We have adopted things. We've been early adopters of things. We're the first state in the country to adopt a right to store. You have a right to store your own power, and you have a right to store it free from regulation. That was unique. When I testified, I said, listen, if I go and purchase a case of water from the local grocery store and I bring it back to my house and I set it in my garage, the grocery store should no longer have any authority over what I do with it. If I want to dump it down the drain, I can dump it down the drain. If I want to use it to water my plants, it's up to me. So Colorado, this should be right up Colorado's alley. This should be bipartisan legislation that they should be embracing this, because it doesn't, ratepayers aren't on the hook and taxpayers aren't on the hook. For either one, you have this great economic development tool that neither ratepayers nor taxpayers have. It isn't on their back. So listen, I'm a fan. I love it.
Yeah, amen. As we're coming up on time here, Glenn, did you want to, where can people find your work and the stuff that you do on this? Just give you a chance to plug that before we wrap up here.
So we've got a website. It's advocates4CRE.org. Also on LinkedIn, I try to post things on LinkedIn, every few days or so. So if you follow us on LinkedIn, you'll find all those things.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us, Glenn. Amy, we'll kick it over to you for the big takeaways for our listeners before we wrap up.
Yeah, no, sorry, I've got my glasses back on, everybody. You'll just have to deal with the glare for a minute. But first of all, I'd leave you with this. This is a free marketeers. This is really an economic development tool that everyone should be able to embrace. I say free marketeer because that's a perspective that we come from. But for anybody who wants to, wants to see the economy of Colorado thrive, this is a no-brainer. And I am hoping the other one is I'm going to look forward to bipartisan legislation. I hope next year we'll be keeping an eye on that. But last thing, I say this all the time, even though this is out there and it's a great idea, take care of your own, have your own mini consumer regulated electricity, get your own generator.
That's a good way to frame it. That does it for us for another episode of PowerGab. If you like what you saw here, you can head on over to iitv.org for our entire back catalog. We release new episodes every single week. We're also available wherever you get your audio podcasts, whether that's Spotify or Apple. And if you would like to suggest future show topics, or you want to comment on an episode or suggest future guests, feel free to reach out at info@powergab.org. We love to hear from our listeners. But until next time, we'll see you.